Okay, it doesn't sound like it's on, so I guess it is. So, no, I'd like to say a special thanks to Bill. Bill contacted me about back in December, right around Christmas time, and has just been marvelous in helping arrange today, and his shuttling me around and about, and has made my trip up to New York incredibly pleasant and a lot of fun. And I also want to thank the Naval Order of the United States, the New York Commandery, for inviting me up here. It's a real privilege and an honor to get to come up today and share this story with you all. Bill was explaining to me that you guys had an event recently with Admiral Roughhead, and so it's kind of intimidating to come up here after that. So, but again, a real privilege and an honor. And I'd also like to thank Gypsy Da Silva, who's here today. She's a tireless editor at Simon & Schuster, and who is intimately involved in this book. And I'd like to say thank you to her as well.
And I look forward to the next one.
Oh, well.
What is your delivery date?
Next summer. So,
I'll hang in.
she's being way too kind. She knows I'm tedious to work with, I'm sure. So, and she's been busy getting the paperback ready, which will come out this summer. So if you didn't get a copy today, it will be out in paperback. So, but thank you. The publication of The Attack on the Liberty represented a significant journalistic undertaking, including some 300 interviews and a review of more than 12,000 pages of documents gathered from 24 archives on 2 different continents. Not only did it involve sort of that journalistic effort, but for me it was a very personal story. It involved an exploration of a part of my own family history. My father, actually, John Scott, was a young ensign on board the Liberty in June of 1967. In fact, June 8th of 1967, the day of Israel's attack on the Liberty, was his 24th birthday. And so he was on his first ship, his second cruise, and he was the damage control officer as well, which you can imagine he had quite a busy day that day. And he was later awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day. And so this project was one that interested me professionally, but also personally. And so it was a real wonderful opportunity for my dad and I to really spend a lot of time together and to do a lot of this research as well. So hopefully my little remote control here will work. I think a lot of folks here know the story of the Liberty, but I'll give you a little bit of a quick background on it. Here's a photograph of the Liberty in 1966, and we may want to dim the lights a little bit. It might make it a little easier to see for some, but if not, actually that's fine. But the Liberty was part of a select group of ships. They were spy ships. It was a program created in the early 1960s by the Navy and the NSA to basically create a fleet of mobile listening platforms. We stole the idea from the Soviets, who at that time had about 40 fishing trawlers that they converted. They filled them up with linguists and eavesdropping equipment and sent them off to harass American military installations. They would come in so close to the Charleston Naval Base that you could actually see them from the pier at Folly Beach. They were often found down around Cape Canaveral at the space operations, and they kept one of these ships off of Guam throughout the Vietnam War, where they would radio in the takeoff of bombers as they were heading into Vietnam. And so the United States decided we didn't want to be outflanked by the Soviets, and so we set out to create our own fleet of mobile listening platforms. And in doing so, we wanted non-combatant ships. We didn't want to send destroyers or combatant ships that would be provocative. And so we looked for something that would be benign. And World War II cargo ships were the ideal solution. The Liberty was a converted Victory ship from World War II, and they actually brought it back out of mothballs. They put 45 antennae on top of it, reconverted the cargo hold so that they could put radio receivers and eavesdropping equipment, and then they filled it with linguists and sent it off out into the world. The Liberty and all of its sister ships were named in honor of American cities. In fact, the Liberty was named in honor of 10 American towns and cities at that time that were called Liberty, from South Carolina, North Carolina to here in New York as well. And so these ships, as part of their benign appearance, they had very little in the way of armament. They carried 4 50 caliber machine guns and some small arms, which would be ideal if you were fighting off some Somali pirates, but not really great for self-defense if you're going up against fighter jets and torpedo boats. The Liberty actually, prior to the Six-Day War, the Liberty was assigned to West Africa. It had made 4 missions where it sort of inched its way along the West African coast, monitoring sort of the forgotten frontier of the Cold War at that time period, monitoring who was up, who was down, what was going on with Soviet penetration, and things of that nature. That changed on May 24th, 1967. The Liberty actually had just arrived at that point in the Ivory Coast, when a new set of orders rolled off the teletype. 4 sentences directing the Liberty to immediately depart, head north to Spain, take on new linguists and fuel, and head immediately to the Egyptian coast. At this point, in May of 1967, the reason the Liberty got those orders is that war clouds were brewing in the Middle East. Egypt had begun amassing its forces in the Sinai Peninsula, which is that vast desert region that separates Israel from Egypt. And then they announced they were going to close the Strait of Tiran, which is an important waterway for Israel. It's where they bring in a lot of their oil imports, and it's their access to the trade markets in Africa and in Asia. And war at this time appeared imminent, and the United States wanted a front row seat. So the Liberty was then directed to head there. Liberty proceeded north the road to Spain, took on its supplies, and began its trip across the Mediterranean. On June 5th of 1967, as the Liberty was still crossing the Mediterranean, Israel launched its preemptive war against Egypt. That soon escalated to involve Syria and Jordan as well. So, 3 days later, on the morning of June 8th, and with Israel now emerging as the clear victor in the fighting, the Liberty arrived off the coast of the Sinai Peninsula. At 5:15 on the morning of June 8th, the first Israeli recon plane came out and circled the Liberty. My dad was actually on watch that morning and photographed it, took a bearing on it. That began a steady pattern of observation that would last throughout the day. The State Department, in one of its reports, later determined that as many as 8 recon planes came out over the next 9-hour period, flying it sometimes so close, sailors on board the Liberty said they could actually see the pilots and wave to them. The Liberty sailors took confidence in the fact that the ship steamed in international waters. It was a beautiful day, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, had freshly painted hull numbers and markings, its name stenciled across the stern. The American flag fluttered from the mast. And so they actually, on break, many of them went out and sunbathed. That all changed, however, at 1:58 p.m. when Israeli fighters coming in off of land didn't come in to recon it, but instead opened fire on the ship. They strafed the Liberty from bow to stern with rockets and cannons. Fighters then began to sort of crisscross the Liberty literally every minute. They targeted the bridge, the antennae, they targeted the guns. They then began to go across the ship from the sides, trying to disable the engine room. The second wave of fighter bombers joined the attack shortly thereafter, this time armed with napalm, and literally turned the decks into a 3,000-degree inferno. 3 torpedo boats, one of which you can actually see here, joined the attack at 2:31 p.m., strafing the Liberty with 20 and 40 millimeter cannons and 50 caliber machine gun rounds, firing armor-piercing rounds. In a cruel twist of fate, actually, American naval investigators later determined that some of the munitions fired from the torpedo boats were American-made. At 2:35 p.m., a torpedo hit the starboard side of the Liberty, killing more than 24 men. The Liberty immediately rolled 9 degrees. Its generators shut down, power went out, steering failed as the spy ship became dead in the water. The torpedo boats then continued to strafe the ship, killing the helmsman on the bridge, shooting several life rafts the Liberty sailors had dropped in the water in anticipation of having to abandon ship. This incredibly brutal assault left 34 men dead and another 171 injured. To put that in perspective, 2 out of every 3 men on board the Liberty were either killed or injured. The 67-minute attack would prove to be the bloodiest assault on an American ship since World War II. And this photograph that you can see here, actually, this is shortly after the attack, and it looks like it's tilted a little bit. That's actually the list from where the torpedoes hit. So you're actually looking after the ship here, and you can see a little bit of that list. Okay. Back in Washington, President Lyndon Johnson and his advisors gathered in the Situation Room the morning of the attack, and here's a photograph from that meeting. While relieved that neither Egypt or the Soviets were responsible, Johnson and his advisors realized that an attack by Israel, an ally with a loyal domestic following, raised a host of other complicated foreign political issues for the administration. And that's the president with his back to us. It's important to remember that at that time, in 1967, in June of 1967, America was bogged down by the Vietnam War, where 26 men died each day in the jungles of Southeast Asia. In May of 1967, that number spiked to 38 men a day. Johnson's approval numbers had simultaneously plummeted from 61% in March of 1966 to 48% in May of 67. Those numbers would fall to 39% in August, marking his lowest approval during his 45 months in office. Complicating matters was the fact that American Jews, a powerful and important constituency for Johnson, who was facing re-election in 1968, were at the forefront of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And adding to his frustration was the fact that he had done more than any previous president to improve U.S.-Israeli relations. This memo you see here actually reveals the administration's concern over how Vietnam was hurting Johnson's approval ratings in the Jewish community and what it might mean for possible re-election. It says, quote, "If Vietnam is favorably resolved before the elections, defections among Jews will be minimal. If Vietnam persists, a special effort to hold the Jewish vote will be necessary." So all of these issues helped frame the context for how the Johnson administration would handle the attack on the Liberty in the days and the weeks to come. Nicholas Katzenbach, who had been his attorney general, had recently moved over as the second in command of the State Department. And in an interview at his house, actually in New Jersey, he gave me this quote about it. He said, quote, "It was no help if you had a lot of people getting angry at the Israelis. The Israelis screw up the relations, then the Jewish groups are going to bail out the Israelis. It ends up with you, the administration, having a more difficult situation than you would have otherwise." So the Liberty, now riddled with cannon blasts, its deck soaked in blood, and starboard side ripped open by a torpedo, evolved literally in a matter of hours from a top secret intelligence asset to a domestic political liability for the president. That was evident by the declassification of this memo. This was written on the day of the attack, June 8, 1967, by Dr. Luis Tordello, who was the second in command of the NSA at that time period and is a storied figure in NSA history. And in his memo, he wrote, quote, "Captain Vineyard had mentioned during this conversation that consideration was then being given by some unnamed Washington authorities to sink the Liberty in order that newspapermen would be unable to photograph her and thus inflame public opinion against the Israelis. I made an impolite comment about that idea." So senior American officials went so far as to contemplate scuttling an American ship at sea to protect Israel from the public relations fallout of this attack. Meanwhile, back on board the Liberty that night, the full scope of the human devastation of the attack became clear. Crews converted the mess decks into a makeshift hospital. Mattresses were dragged from nearby staterooms and laid out on the tables to comfort the injured. IV bags, which you can actually see one in the back of that photograph, literally dangled from the overhead fluorescent lights. Uninjured sailors were taught how to wash wounds and sew stitches in one another, and penicillin was diluted with sterile water to make sure that they would have enough for the whole crew. Spearheading the effort that night was the ship's 30-year-old doctor. He'd only completed 2 years of a 4-year surgical residency here at Columbia. He had 2 assistants, 2 medical corpsmen, and that was it. The responsibility for treating 171 injured men fell to these 3 individuals. The rest of the Sixth Fleet remained hundreds of miles to the west, and help would not arrive until approximately 6:30 the next morning, leaving the Liberty crew and its tiny medical staff on its own through what would prove to be a very long night. Many of the sailors suffered horrific injuries, as you might imagine. Shrapnel, gunshot wounds, compound fractures, some amputations. The doctor at one point actually told me that he pulled back a piece of torn scalp on one man's head thinking it would just be an injury and found he actually stared down at the man's brain. He ran out of surgical tubing on another occasion and had to actually insert his finger in the chest wall of one man and roll him on his side and drain the blood. The torpedo blast had even fused the eyelids shut of one of the officers who was in the compartment where it went off. This is a photograph actually up on the bridge of Commander William McGonigal, who was the Liberty's skipper. He has a tourniquet. It's a little tough to see because it's a little dark, but he has a tourniquet around his right leg and he's suffering from a concussion. Sailors were manually moving the rudder actually to help steer the ship, and with the navigation system gone that night, Commander McGonigal actually stretched out on the deck and looked up at the heavens and guided the ship by the stars. This is a breakdown of the number of shell hits investigators later counted in the Liberty. As you can see here, there were 821, with 164 in just the bridge and stack area. Now, I interviewed some of these investigators, and they said that they counted only things that were fist size or larger. So all shrapnel and machine gun holes and whatnot that were smaller than that were simply described as innumerable. But that tally doesn't really do justice to the reality of the attack, as captured by these following photos. Many of these were shot soon after daybreak the next morning, when Liberty sailors ventured out to sort of check out the damage firsthand. Remember that photograph of Liberty in port in 1966 when it was, clean and proper, and then you can see it now in 1967, the bridge black. That's a helicopter from the USS America that's medevacing the injured and a destroyer there in the distance. But you can see all the black marks down the side of the ship. Actually, they're shell hits, and that line is oil from where the ship had actually rolled after the torpedo hit. But it gives you a sense of just how beat up the ship was. Here's a shot of the bridge and smokestack, and you can see actually what are literally bowling ball sized holes there. And it's a little dark, at least from my perspective, but this is a photo that lends some perspective on just how large some of these shell hits were. This is Dennis Eichelberry. He's a character in the book for those of you who have read it, and you can see the hit next to him is literally head size. This is one of the gun tubs on the bow. Liberty's gunners were killed in the first wave of the attack, and as you can see here, there were two direct hits right on the gun tub. And the next morning, their blood, this is the backside of that same gun tub, still stained the forecastle. This is a photograph of Commander William McGonigal holding up the core of an armor-piercing machine gun round. These rounds, literally, they shattered coffee mugs in the mess deck. He dug that one out of the navigation book on the bridge. They literally lodged in bulkheads throughout the ship. Men in the engine room would later use pliers to wrench them free from the bulkheads. And here's one actually still stuck in the bulkhead. As one of the officers told me, quote, "There wasn't any place that was safe. If it was your day to get hit, you were going to get hit." Here's a photograph of my father. He's inspecting it. That's a shoring job that the damage control party put together. And behind that actually is a flooded compartment. He's inspecting some cracks they've got there. The letter there next to it is to give you a little bit of personal family story. When I began research on this project in 2006, my grandmother passed away. My father and his brothers were cleaning out their house in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we're up in the attic and found an old trunk and opened up that trunk, and in it found one of his sea bags. And inside that were 75 letters that he had written to his parents and in their responses to him throughout this entire period. Many of those letters are quoted in the book. But this is actually the letter my father wrote some 36 hours after the attack to his parents, and you can see it's written on stationery of the Liberty stationery, and he starts off, "Dear family," and then in all caps, "I am alive and unhurt." Within hours of the attack, Israel apologized, blaming it on a series of tactical blunders that resulted in its forces mistakenly concluding that the Liberty was an Egyptian horse and troop transport, a fraction of the spy ship's size. It was an explanation, however, that many in Washington found difficult to believe. The day after the attack, President Johnson gathered in the cabinet room, pictured here, with his advisors on the Special Committee of the National Security Council. These declassified handwritten meeting minutes, pictured here, show that the Liberty was the subject of heated discussion as Johnson's advisors spurned the idea that this was a tragic accident. Clark Clifford, who was head of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and one of Johnson's most pro-Israel advisors, demanded that the attackers be punished. And his strong comments on the Liberty, echoed by many of the others on the meeting minutes there that were there that day, reflect a hostility that was never shared with the American public at that time. As Clifford said, and I've translated it there because the handwriting's so bad. And it's amazing to think, on a side note, that the National Security Council meeting minutes were recorded by hand in such poor handwriting. But he said, quote, "My concern is that we're not tough enough. Handle it as if the Arabs or the USSR had done it. Manner egregious, inconceivable that it was an accident. 3 strafing passes, 3 torpedo boats. Set forth facts, punish Israelis responsible." And then in the left-hand corner, you can see, it's hardly legible, but it says, "President subscribed 100%. So, to senior administration officials, the idea that the attack on the Liberty was a case of friendly fire seemed to defy logic. Friendly fire incidents tend to happen in bad weather, at night. They tend to be over in a matter of seconds, maybe minutes. The attack on the Liberty, in contrast, happened on a sunny day in international waters. It went on for 67 minutes. It involved two branches of Israel's vaunted military. In the heat of battle, Liberty officers were able to identify the hull and flag on a small, swift-moving Israeli torpedo boat, but Israeli naval forces said they couldn't identify the Liberty's man-sized hull numbers and American flag. So to many, that just seemed impossible. And Secretary of State Dean Rusk captures that in this quotation, in which he said, Everyone's hearing with that. But Dean Rusk captured that in this quote when he said, "I just don't believe it was an accident or trigger-happy local commanders. It was just too much of a sustained effort to disable and sink the Liberty." But it wasn't just politicians who disputed Israel's explanation. Senior leaders of the intelligence community also were convinced the attack was no accident. Dick Helms, who was CIA director at the time, said, quote, I don't think there can be any doubt that the Israelis knew exactly what they were doing. Marshall Carter, who's the director of the NSA, said, quote, it couldn't be anything else but deliberate. And Tom Hughes, who headed the State Department's Intelligence Bureau, told me, quote, we were quite convinced that the Israelis knew what they were doing. And, of course, many senior Navy officers refused to believe Israel. Vice Admiral Jerome King, who in 1967 was the senior aide to the CNO at that time, Admiral David McDonald, specifically challenges the idea that this was a friendly fire attack in this quote that he told me in the course of my research. Quote, it certainly was not mistaken identity. I don't buy it. I never did. Nobody that I knew ever did either. It wasn't as though it was at night or a rainy day or anything like that. There wasn't any excuse for not knowing what the ship was. You could divine from just the apparatus on deck, all the antennae and so on, what its mission was. So how did Israeli pilots fail to identify the Liberty? How, over multiple strafing passes, often at low altitudes, had no pilot noticed the spy ship's unique markings or American flag? After all, Egyptian ships are marked in Arabic script, not Western letters. Transcripts of Israeli communications that have become available only in recent years show that the case is not as simple as the Israeli government wanted the Americans to believe in 1967. This excerpt from pilot communication shows that 2 minutes before the strafing began, a weapons system officer in General Headquarters blurted out, "What is it? Americans?" Despite doubts raised about the ship's identity, Israel's chief air controller neither halted the impending assault nor ordered his fighters to look for identifying markings or a flag as the plane zeroed in on the Liberty. These abbreviated excerpts show the excitement and exuberance both pilots and air controllers shared as the attack on the Liberty unfolded. A pilot joked at one point during the strafing run that hitting the defenseless ship was easier than shooting down MiGs. Another, as you can see here, quipped that it would be a mitzvah, a blessing or a kind deed, to sink the Liberty before the Navy arrived. Is he screwing her? The chief air controller asked at one point. He's going down on her with napalm all the time, answered another. Shortly before the planes exhausted all their ammunition, the chief air controller finally asked the pilots to look for a flag. One of the pilots buzzed the ship moments later and spotted the Liberty's hull number. He radioed it to ground control. As these transcripts show, any doubt over the ship's identity vanished. What country? Probably American. What? Probably American. At that point in time, in my mind, it was an American ship. I was sure it was an American ship. Those are the words of Lieutenant Colonel Kislev, who was Israel's head air controller at that time. Israel had conclusively identified the Liberty as much as 26 minutes before the fatal torpedo strike. According to Israeli documents, that report was passed to the Israeli Navy, where the Vice Chief of Naval Operations dismissed it as camouflage writing in order to allow an Egyptian ship to enter the area. Israeli documents also show that at least 2 other Israeli naval officers suspected that before the torpedo attack, the ship they were zeroing in on was none other than the Liberty that they had seen that same morning. Neither intervened to halt the attack. On board the Liberty at that time, far below deck, sailors burned classified materials, bagged up magnetic tapes, and destroyed key cards until word was passed to stand by for a torpedo attack. At that point, they stopped what they were doing. They buttoned up their shirts, tucked their pants legs into their socks to protect against flash burn, and lay down on the deck. Many prayed. One sailor, who didn't want to see what was about to happen, took off his glasses and put them in the front pocket of his shirt. At 2:35 p.m., the torpedo struck in an instant into the lives of more than 24 men. Israeli ambassador Avram Harman read these details coming off reports in the Israeli embassy in Washington, and he told his superiors in Jerusalem that he believed several parties were guilty of negligence. Harman, in this telegram to the prime minister actually, demanded that Israel prosecute the attackers. At one point, he even suggested that they invite American journalists to Israel to cover the trial. As he wrote in his telegram here, in a severe situation created, the only way to soften the results is if we could let the U.S. government know already today we intend to prosecute people in connection with this disaster. Meanwhile, 6 days after the attack, the full scope of what we now know as a preventable torpedo attack finally became clear as the Liberty limped into Malta for repairs. At sea, only the top few feet of the torpedo hull were visible, as you can see here, a little spot there below where the men are. Once in dry dock, however, the full scope of the damage became clear. The teardrop-shaped hull measured 24 feet tall and 39 feet wide. The men in the foreground actually give you some perspective on the size of the hull. This is the first time this photograph's ever been showed publicly. I just got it in an email from a Liberty sailor about a week ago who read the book. He's never been to any of the Liberty reunions or whatnot, but he sent me an email saying that he had these photographs and forwarded this along and gave me permission to share it. So it's a very powerful photo, I think, and one of the best, I think, that really captures just how large that torpedo hole really was. So violent was that torpedo's explosion that it literally vaporized some of the men, prompting Liberty skipper William McGonigal to have to write this painful condolence letter to some of the families. Quote, "It is with profound regret that your husband's body was lost at sea and is unrecoverable, or has not yet been positively identified." Back in Washington, the Liberty soon became a political tug of war between Israel and the United States. Soon after the attack, Secretary of State Dean Rusk sent Israel's ambassador a stinging letter describing the attack as, quote, "quite literally incomprehensible," and arguing that it represented, quote, "wanton disregard for human life." Rusk demanded Israel punish the attackers. Israeli diplomats feared the United States planned to use the attack on the Liberty as a political tool to dampen the American public's support of Israel, which was running at a high during the Six-Day War. This was very dangerous ground for Israel at a time when with the war now over, and as they were going to have to deal with controversial issues like territorial gains and refugee status. So Israel decided to fight back, as this excerpt from a telegram shows, launching their own political and media spin campaign. This is a letter to their foreign ministry saying, quote, "Our informative process must avoid confrontation with the United States since it's clear the American public, if faced with a direct argument, will accept its government's version." Israeli diplomats tapped influential American Jews who were close friends of President Johnson's for help. Documents show that Eugene Rostow, who was third in command of the State Department at that time, repeatedly shared privileged information about American strategy on handling the Liberty with Israeli diplomats, essentially giving them the upper hand. Rostow's support effect of Israel was so pronounced during the entire Six-Day War that Tom Hughes, the director of the State Department's Intelligence Bureau, told me in an interview that Rostow acted as though he were a defense lawyer for the Israelis at this time. Others who assisted the diplomats were Abe Fortas, Supreme Court Justice, and Arthur Goldberg, who was the United States' ambassador to the United Nations at that time. This telegram not only shows the great influence Israeli diplomats had over the American media, in this case able to kill a potential news story, but it also shows how terrified diplomats were of a potential congressional investigation, which would require Liberty sailors testifying, the story landing back on the front pages, etc. And so this was a telegram actually from their foreign ministry back to Jerusalem saying, quote, "A reliable journalistic source informs that the authorized Democratic representative from New York, Otis Pipe, member of the Armed Forces Committee, is under pressure by his constituency to investigate the incident. We've made sure that the journalistic source will refrain from writing about this for now." This telegram is another that shows how Israeli diplomats work the media to kill critical stories and slant others in favor of Israel. The day after the attack, President Johnson met in the White House for an off-the-record interview with a Newsweek reporter, in which he told this reporter that he believed Israel deliberately attacked the Liberty to prevent it from spying. Israeli officials in their embassy learned the details of Johnson's interview within 24 hours and began pressuring Newsweek to tone down its story about the leak, which, as you can see from this telegram, Newsweek did. Quote, "The Newsweek editorial has made changes in the last proofreading of the news item compared with the original version that I was shown last night. It toned down the version by adding a question mark to the heading, leaving out the words deliberate attack and a commentary paragraph that said the leak is intended to free American policymakers from the pressure of pro-Israel public opinion. And that's actually the headline that ran in Newsweek. But diplomats also needed to tone down President Johnson, who was out talking to the reporters and giving them his personal views and whatnot. And this is a telegram actually that shows that. So in order to pressure Johnson, diplomats proposed, if necessary, accusing him of blood libel. The embassy tapped Abe Fortas and Washington lawyer David Ginsburg to make sure Johnson got the message. And as the historical record shows, he did. Worn out by the Middle East crisis in Vietnam, Johnson looked for a compromise that would guarantee that American families were compensated, yet not risk a clash with Israel and its domestic supporters. So he ordered Nicholas Katzenbach, second in command of the State Department at that point, to negotiate a deal. If Israel publicly apologized for the attack and paid reparations, America would let it go. No more questions asked. So in this quote, that is from an interview I had with Katzenbach, he summed up the president's reasoning on this. He said, quote, his thinking on it was the more generous they were about admitting a mistake and paying reparations, paying off the families, the easier it would be for the United States to ignore the incident. The administration's decision not to dig into the Liberty was evident in the incredibly weak effort the Navy made to investigate the attack. Shallow, cursory, and perfunctory were words Liberty officers all used to describe the court of inquiry, which spent 2 days interviewing crew members in Malta for an investigation into an attack that had killed 34 men. The transcript of those proceedings showed just how shallow it truly was. The Liberty's chief engineer was asked only 13 questions. A chief petty officer who was on deck during the air attack and a good witness about it was asked only 11 questions. Another one of the ship's officers was asked only 5. The final transcript of all this testimony was only 158 pages. And my wife's a lawyer, and she's told me that she's had a single deposition run longer than 158 pages. So in the end, the Liberty's entire court of inquiry was completed in just 8 days, less time than it took to bury some of the dead. It's important to note that that 8 days included travel time for the Navy's senior officers to fly from London to Malta, interview the crew members, return to London, deliberate, and type up the final report. But in evaluating the Liberty's Court of Inquiry, it's worth comparing it to that of the Pueblo. Okay. The Liberty's Court of Inquiry lasted 8 days, interviewed only 14 witnesses, and it was only 158 pages. The Pueblo Court of Inquiry would last 3.5 months, interview 104 witnesses, and produce a transcript that was nearly 3,400 pages long. Back in Washington, Deputy Defense Secretary Cyrus Vance oversaw the Pentagon's effort to condense the Liberty's Court of Inquiry into a declassified summary that they could give out to the press and the families. It was important that the Court of Inquiry support Israel's version of events and not raise questions. So the overt effort by Vance's office to protect Israel from the potential public relations fallout soon angered senior Navy officers. This is a handwritten memo I found in the Navy's archives by Chief of Naval Operations Admiral David McDonald that he wrote after reading the draft prepared for the public by Vance's office, in which he wrote, translated his handwriting there, but I think that much of this is extraneous, and it leaves me with the feeling that we're trying our best to excuse the attackers. Were I a parent of one of the deceased, this release would burn me up. I myself do not subscribe to it. Likewise, Cyrus Vance clashed with NSA Director Marshall Carter when the two men were summoned before a secret meeting of the Committee of the House Appropriations Committee. When asked whether he believed Israel deliberately targeted the Liberty, Carter responded, quote, "It couldn't be anything else but deliberate." Afterward, Vance pulled Carter aside and ordered him to, quote, "keep his mouth shut." The implication was clear. Regardless of the opinions of Carter and other senior NSA leaders, Vance demanded that these men remain silent. NSA Chief of Staff Jerry Burke, whom I interviewed in the course of my research, told me precisely that in an interview, as you can see here. Quote, "There was absolutely no question in anybody's minds that the Israelis had done it deliberately. I was angrier because of the cover-up, if that's possible, than of the incident itself. Because there was no doubt in my mind that they did it right from the outset. That was no mystery. The only mystery to me was why was this thing being covered up." American officials had hoped that Israel would punish the attackers, as Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Israeli Ambassador Avraham Harman had demanded. In August, American officials learned that the Israeli judge tasked to examine the attack instead had exonerated everyone. The assault on the Liberty, which raged for an hour, a clear afternoon in international waters, was the most violent attack on American warship since World War II. Yet Israel's investigating judge could find no evidence of wrongdoing, no negligence, no violation of military procedure. American officials slammed that decision, as evidenced by this handwritten memo by Dr. Luis Tordella, the NSA's deputy director, in which he wrote, quote, he's writing this about their investigation. A nice whitewash for a group of ignorant, stupid, and inept XXXXX. If the attackers had not been Hebrew, there would have been quite a commotion. Such crass stupidity, 30 knots, warship, 2 guns, etc., does not even do credit to the Nigerian Navy. Tordella's memo reflected the special treatment many in Washington recognized that Israel received in the aftermath of the attack on the Liberty. The failure to reprimand anyone left lingering resentment among many in the United States. Vice Chief of Naval Operations at that time, Admiral Horatio Rivera, was later asked for his most prominent memory of the attack on the Liberty, and he responded with one sentence: "My anger and frustration at our not punishing the attackers." 74 days after the torpedo ripped open the side of the Liberty and nearly 6,000 miles from where it happened, the remains of 5 sailors and 1 Marine were laid to rest in a mass grave in Arlington. The single casket that you see here held little more than bone fragments and tissue shoveled into body bags 2 months earlier in Malta. Even in the burial of the last of the Liberty veterans, the government was careful to downplay precisely how these men were killed. That was evident by the headstone that simply read, quote, "died in the Eastern Mediterranean." In 1982, however, after pressure from the Liberty veterans, the government changed that headstone to read, quote, "killed USS Liberty." The administration's effort to de-emphasize the Liberty also spilled over into the presentation of awards in June 1968. Liberty skipper William McGonigal was nominated for the Medal of Honor, an award customarily presented by the President at the White House. President Johnson in 1968 had presented at least 9 Medals of Honors to recipients at the White House, but McGonigal would not be so lucky. The Liberty remained too politically sensitive. As this memo shows that I found in the LBJ library, Johnson's senior military aide, James Cross, urged the president not to present McGonigal's medal in person and to make sure the White House issued no press release. Instead, McGonigal was presented the Medal of Honor in a low-key ceremony at the Washington Navy Yard. Rather than honor McGonigal with the nation's highest award for heroism, Johnson, who at that time was less than 4 miles away in the White House, opted instead to hand out diplomas to graduates of the Capitol Page High School. In 1968, Israel paid $3.3 million to the families of the men killed. A year later, they paid another $3 million to the men who were injured, but then balked at paying the $7.6 million for the loss of the Liberty, which was ultimately scrapped. At one point, Israel offered a token sum of $100,000 to settle the debt, but the United States refused. Negotiations dragged on until 1980, and by then the bill for the Liberty had grown to more than $17 million with interest. Under threat of a congressional investigation, Israel struck a deal to pay $6 million in 3 annual installments, and Jimmy Carter's administration accepted that. Despite the argument of some that Israel's payment of reparations effectively closed the book on the Liberty, the attack and our government's handling of the affair are still very much a daily part of many lives. Chris Armstrong, whose father was Liberty XO Phil Armstrong, Naval Academy graduate class of 1953, sent me this email not too long ago and gave me permission to share it with you all. He says, quote, "I was one of the recipients of cash from Israel, just recycled USA money, I'm sure, $52,000. However, no money can replace a father, especially at age 3. It paid for my college education, but not much else. I would give it all back, and then some. My emotional scars are very deep from this incident." So, thank you very much for having me today. The brakes essentially on the U.S. doing any real thorough investigation. And so what was left with senior officials at the NSA was essentially educated guesswork. They did get confirmation, according to one of the senior NSA officials, that Israel had, in fact, green-lighted the attack. But as for motive, they were left only with guesswork. It came down to, in their view, essentially Israel wanted an impenetrable defense line. The Liberty was a spy ship. It was parked there off the coast of Egypt at a time when they were reallocating their forces from Egypt up to Syria, and they weren't going to take any risks. And I have a quote from one official in the book I'll paraphrase now what she said, Israel's our ally, but when it comes to their national security, they will take no chances. And so that even in the case of the Liberty, they'd be willing to sideline an American ship. So that's the view of the senior folks at the NSA that work this problem. Yes, sir.
Did you ever find, because I've read that there may have been some submarine surveillance and also aerial surveillance, did you ever find any support for that in your research?
I did, actually. Well, there's been talk
Can
of
you go to the mic, please?
I'm afraid it's going to start whistling again. So, there's been talk over the years. There's been talk over the years that there was a submarine that was there and photographed the attack on the Liberty, and that's kind of floated around out there. I think is on the internet. If you look, you'll see some of that. And the reality is, in the course of my research, actually, I got access to Admiral John McCain's. Current Senator John McCain's father actually was Sincus Navier at that time period in London, and his deputy actually wrote some letters about the Liberty that survived him. He's since passed away, Admiral Wiley, in which he actually talks about the submarine. And what happened is, according to his version, is that actually they pulled that submarine when the hostilities broke out. And at that point, they then drafted because the submarine operated purely under Navy control. They had the authority. They drafted an order and had the submarine pulled. They then drafted a similar order and gave it to Admiral McCain to pull Liberty as well. The Liberty had a unique set of operational orders in that it was a Navy ship, yes, but it was operated, as part of this program with the NSA through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Admiral Wiley said that McCain was a very political animal, in that he was very worried about ruffling any feathers. So he sat on it. And then, sure enough, June 8th rolled around, and the order never went in, and the Liberty was attacked as a result of that. But he did address the fact that the submarine was, in fact, pulled out earlier. And I have no reason to doubt that's not the case.
What about aerial surveillance?
There was the United States at that time was actually flying airborne missions, Navy missions out of Athens, and we did have a spy plane that was in the general vicinity, but they only intercepted the communications after the attack, and it was some helicopters that were sent out. And those helicopters actually, they did confirm, one of the important pieces of information is they did confirm the fact that the Liberty was flying an American flag, because the Israelis disputed that and said, it wasn't flying an American flag, it was unmarked or whatnot. But the little bit of intercepts that we got after the attack from some of their helicopters in the area confirmed the fact that the Liberty was in fact flying its American flag. So, yeah.
Jim, much earlier that day, as you know, the Israelis had identified the Liberty according to a Jane's manual. And how do you account for the long delay in that information, if ever, getting to the Air Force? They knew many, many hours before that the Liberty had been identified.
Yeah, no, they did. They actually, that flight, that initial recon flight that morning was out, the one that my father witnessed. They actually landed, they got the hull number off the ship, they looked it up, and they put that information in, and even by Israel's own account, they put it on their plotting board. And they just said during a shift change right before the attack, someone accidentally took the Liberty's plug off of the plotting board, and therefore it was as if the ship had never been there, and they didn't know it was there and attacked anyway. But that was a rationale that I think people inside the U.S. administration found pretty hard to swallow, that it was there and it wasn't there. So, yeah. So,
we talked a little bit about it at the table beforehand. It's, I think, based upon your own research and research I personally have done and the obviousness of the situation, I think it's inconceivable that Israel did not understand that this was an American ship when it went in for the attack. So the question really that's the big question to me, and I'm interested in your response to that, is why would Israel knowingly attack a ship which they knew to be an American at a time when their own country was in peril? And the arguments that have been asserted, just to go through this by some others who've researched this issue, is that they feel that this was a deliberate attack by Israel after they determined that the United States had compromised its military plans and delivered it through the CIA and through the British to the Arabs, and that they could no longer tolerate this as they were planning to move on.
Yeah. What Nicholas Katzenbach told me is that they thought that in the administration that the Israelis were worried about what the Liberty. They didn't know exactly what the Liberty was getting, but they were worried about what it could be getting, and so they were really worried. Like, it wasn't so much the devil that you know; it's the devil that you think you know, and so that they weren't exactly sure what all we were getting, but they weren't willing to take that chance as to what we were going to get. And and take those risks. So, but again, the where the torpedo hit actually was in the NSA spaces, and so all the information and intelligence that they had gathered that day was lost and it was all destroyed.
One of the overflights was allegedly by a flying boxcar with very sensitive
Yes.
Information, and was picking up very specific information being transmitted to Cyprus by the ship, which detailed the positions of all of the Israeli operational units, giving a battle map to the Arabs.
Yeah, some of that I think is a little, the Liberty actually was not transmitting anything to Cyprus. I mean, they would gather it all up and they would typically go in and put it all in a diplomatic pouch, drop it off in an embassy, and it would be flown back that way. They had limited capability for actually being able to send signals back. They had this huge dish on the back, it was the Treshcom, that they could send out at about 100 words a minute if they had. It was like a relay that bounced off the surface of the moon. And that was about as high-tech equipment as they had to be able to do that. So, and that was directed only to go back to Maryland. So the idea that they were sending stuff to Cyprus that way, just the technology wasn't there for them to do that.
So why would Israel knowingly attack a ship by its foremost ally?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as the folks in the NSA said at that time period, it was a matter of they wanted an impenetrable defense line. That when it comes down to Israeli national security, they're not going to take any chances. And an American ship, out there when they don't know where the information's going, what they're getting, was a threat to that. Now, the U.S. government thought that it was a decision made, a tactical military decision, as opposed to a civilian political decision. And that was part of the reason why the U.S. government was willing to let it go away. They figured that a senior officer somewhere, probably in the Sinai or in a war room there in Tel Aviv, was making a tactical command decision. And it wasn't something that the prime minister was saying, all right, now we're going to go ahead and we're actively going to attack a U.S. ship, and it's going to be the end of relations. And so as a result of that, they were more willing to let it go.
Follow on that, I'm sorry, was there precedence for attacking ships?
No, actually, the thing is, and that's a good point. These ships were spy ships, and everybody, sophisticated militaries like ours and the Soviets, as well as unsophisticated militaries like where the Liberty was on the coast of West Africa, knew exactly what these ships did. The USS Oxford was one of the Liberty's sister ships, and it was parked off of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Navy would come out and they would put their fire control radar on it, and they harassed it and whatnot. And in fact, the Liberty had done 4 missions prior to the mission on which it was attacked. And on those cruises, these relatively unsophisticated West African navies would come out and harass it as well. So I mean, and that's kind of, I think, what Dr. Tordell is addressing in that handwritten memo there at the end is that, doesn't do credit to the Nigerian Navy as sort of in reference to the fact that the Liberty was harassed even on its earlier mission. So in that kind of, Israel had a very sophisticated military, and for them to claim, hey, we didn't know what this lone ship is that is bristling with antenna, so much so that it looks like a porcupine, as one of the admirals said at that time period, when, hey, the Nigerian Navy, the Cuban military, everybody else seems to know exactly what they are. It sort of defied logic for them.
We got time for like 3 more, so questions, quick, real quick.
Sorry.
Just a point here, obviously we recognize Israel in 48.
Ron, question, please.
The question is basically this. In 1956, the United States chose the side of Egypt. Someone said this would never happen again, that the United States would be on the side of somebody not on Israel's side, pushing back the French and the English and the Israelis. The question is, we were all junior officers or something in that time period, but the point is 10 years before is not a long time if you're 40 or 50 or 60 years old. So are they still thinking about the fact that we might tell them to buck off or something?
But there was some
Limit
discussion.
their victory?
There was some discussion that some of these commanders who were in these tactical leadership roles at that time would have been there during the Suez Canal crisis and would have remembered that as well. And so you have to remember there's only about a 10-year difference there from the Suez Canal crisis, and so they would have certainly viewed it through that lens. So that could have been a factor, and it talked about that in the United States as whether or not that hangover of the Suez Canal crisis played a role in the decision-making process.
Over here, Jim Traeger.
Okay. There was a reference in your book
Yeah.
to an instruction from the CNO,
Yes.
it would have been superior to Admiral McKean, that claimed that the Liberty be removed
Yes.
to 100 miles from
Yes.
the coast. Whatever happened to that order, which could have theoretically prevented this whole thing from happening?
Exactly. What he's talking about is on June 7th, the Chief of Naval Operations had his sort of daily operational notes or whatever. And there was 2 sentences at the very end that said, USS Liberty is going to be steaming 12.5 miles off the Egyptian coast, 6.5 miles off the Israeli coast. He immediately said, this is a bad idea. He told his executive, his senior aide, he said, the ship needs to be pulled farther back. Take care of it. I'm on my way to Annapolis for the day. When I get back, it better be done. He came back that afternoon, and as he was headed out the door on the evening of June 7th, his assistant said, all right, the Joint Chiefs are going to pull it back 20 miles now instead of the 12 and a half. And he said, I wouldn't even let her go down that way now. It's exactly what he wrote in this memo. Pull the ship all the way back 100 miles where to where the orders are for the rest of Sixth Fleet. Take care of it. So they then began at that point, picked up the phone, called over to Sincus Navier in London, try to get a hold of the ship or whatnot. Sent off half dozen messages that were, a few of which were routed to other places, including the Philippines, all of which never arrived in time for the Liberty to actually pull farther back, and the Liberty was in fact attacked as a result of that. So,
One over here, or two over here.
okay.
Were there unfriendly ships, were there Egyptian ships in the area as well?
There's nothing
Or
in the area. There's absolutely nothing out there. I mean, in fact, actually, if you talk to Liberty sailors, about 2 days prior, they saw their last ship, and then it was just completely empty ocean out there. So Egypt, had a very small and sophisticated navy at that time period. In fact, if you look them up in 1967, the Jane's fighting ships, it's like a page and a half. And they would have also, their argument was, well, it looked like this Egyptian ship, the El Kasur, which if you look at that in Jane's fighting ships, it's the same as the Liberty. It's a horse and troop transport with no real armament. I mean, it's not an offensive ship like you would expect to find something like a cruiser or destroyer. So
has any Israeli military or politician said that they were ordered to do this? And one other question. Comment on Bamford's book.
Yeah.
With NSA.
Yeah. No, in fact, Israel, I went over and spent actually a couple weeks in Israel, and I interviewed pretty much everyone that was involved in Liberty that would agree to be interviewed. And there are not as many as you would hope that are willing to talk about it. But those that I did talk to, all say that, hey, it was just a tragic accident, et cetera. And James Bamford, I don't know what you want me to comment on James Bamford's book.
Well, you said NSA knew.
Yeah, Bamford has written about the Liberty on a number of occasions. Body Secrets, Puzzle Palace. He's done terrific books on the NSA. If you ever get a chance to read them and have it, I think Bamford's had wonderful sources inside the NSA, a number of whom I talked to as well. And his information is on par with what they're telling him what they tell me as well. So that they all believe it. If you talk to these senior officials at the NSA, they're all unanimous in that none of them believed it was an accident. I showed you a couple quotes from some of these guys. They were all pretty adamant. And these were individuals who were in the know at that time. They had access to all the files. They were there. They were living that current context in which we were looking back into. So.
And final thing, Commander's privilege, as having read the very end, you paid a visit to Israel. Your dad did not go with you when you visited one of the pilots. Could you?
Yeah, I went to Israel to do research in 2007, and my father went with me, and he was interested in going over there. And so when we went, he said, look, if any of these guys you interview or want to meet me, I'm more than happy to do it. It's one of my dad's shipmates said he was probably the most well-adjusted man who walked off that ship, and harbors no ill will. So we went over on a father and son trip, and I was one of the pilots, the guy who led the initial wave of the attack, called him up, and he said, I don't want to be interviewed, but I'll agree to have coffee with you. And I said, okay, I'll come over for coffee. And so I went, and I was sitting in his house in the suburbs outside of Tel Aviv. And
With your father?
No, my dad's back at the hotel, and so I was he was asking me how my trip was in Israel. I told my father and I were here together. And he asked me, he goes, why are you interested in the Liberty? It's 40 years ago. And I said, well, my dad was one of the officers on the ship. And his eyes got real big, and he said, was your dad's here in Israel with you? And I said, yes, he's back at the hotel. And he said, well, why didn't you bring him with you? And I said, well, I thought that might be awkward. And he said, nonsense. I want to meet him. I insist on meeting him. Call him. And so I had a cell phone with me, so I called my dad, and I invited him over. And so my dad came over, and this pilot actually was Yifta Spector, who was a very legendary pilot in the Israeli Air Force. In fact, he participated in the attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor in the 1980s, and sort of a legendary fighting ace. And so he came over, and he was over there at the time. He was building a swing set for his grandkids in his backyard. He's about 3 years older than my dad was at the time. And he's all sweaty, and whatnot. Here's my dad, and they came face to face, and Spector went right up to my dad. And my dad's an imposing guy. He's almost 6'5". He's 6'4". He's really tall, and here's a pilot who's It was a good bit shorter, and he goes right up to him, sticks his hand out, and says, I'm sorry, I apologize for it all. And my dad thanked him, and they chatted for a little bit about it. But I know for my father, it was a really powerful personal experience. As he said, look, I was immediately shipped off to Vietnam. Not long after that, no one in the government, no one ever in the Navy ever said, hey, we're sorry you guys went through this. We just went to Vietnam, and he said, here's the first apology for it all coming from, one of the pilots who had led the attack. And so it meant a lot to him. He picked up, we were driving in a taxi cab to Jerusalem. He called my mom on his cell phone back in the U.S., which I'm sure was probably a $200 phone bill, just to relate that experience that he had there. So it was certainly a very, very powerful thing.
I think as, Rich, did you have a comment, and then we'll end with this?
Given the fact that this was your father,
Yeah.
and I know my emotions are all over the map.
Yeah.
Two questions. What would you like to see going forward, and how do we go forward?
Yeah, there's been a lot of the Liberty veterans have pushed for years for a new investigation. As you can see, the Court of Inquiry was incredibly shallow. They were barred, and I didn't mention it in the thing, but they were barred from actually going to Israel. The investigators, the Navy investigators wanted to go to Israel, talk to the attackers, get their war logs. They were told, you're not going to go do any of that, come back with what you got. So we only got that one side of the story, basically. And so there's been a lot of veterans have pushed for a new investigation. Honestly, I don't think that will ever happen. The United States the world is such a busy place, and there's so much going on that I just don't see that happening. But what I could see happening that I think would actually mean a lot to the veterans would be like what happened in the case of the USS Indianapolis, when the skipper of the Indianapolis later committed suicide, but I think it was back around 2000 or so, when Congress did a resolution, if I recall, and it was basically saying, you weren't given all the facts, and you were basically hung out to dry, and did that as a resolution. Sort of helped tie it off, I think, that way. And I think there could be something like that, a gesture like that, would really end it for a lot of these men. I think would be a real sense of closure for them, and I think would be a great thing for the government to do. So, as for where we go forward, one of the points I try to argue in the book is that, 7 months after the attack on the Liberty, that North Korea seized the Pueblo. It was the exact same type mission. There they were off the coast of North Korea. And Pete Bucher, who was the skipper of the Pueblo, later said he didn't know anything about the Liberty at the time, and he said, had I known about the Liberty, there was no way I ever would have taken my ship there. And in fact, I talked to one of the breach analysts at the NSA at that time period. His job was to determine when things like the Liberty happened or the Pueblo, how serious were these threats to national security? And he said the Pueblo was without a doubt the biggest breach in American national security in modern history, because that ship, combined with the stuff that all that was passed on to the Soviets, which was then passed on to North Vietnam, would come back to haunt us for years to come. And so there were certainly lessons, I think, that could have been learned from the Liberty that might have prevented the Pueblo. It's one of the points I make in the book. And there's actually, the last thing I'll say, if you read the entire 500 or so published pages of the Pueblo court hearings before Congress, there's one exchange between Admiral Thomas Moore and Otis Pike, actually, in New York, which he says, what did the Liberty teach us, basically? And Moore kind of fumbled, and he says, we put a few more guns on it, we changed some communications protocols, et cetera. But what he doesn't say, and what is unwritten there, is that it really taught us nothing. Because that January morning in 1968, when the Pueblo was out there, everything happened the exact same way it had happened there. A ship by itself, cut off, that ultimately was seized. That would lead to the loss of all this great intelligence. So, I think these things have a ripple effect that go throughout.